In 1994, EA Canada released The Need for Speed, a racing game that was initially a 3DO exclusive, though it later got ported to other platforms. A collaboration with the enthusiast magazine Road and Track, the game was a financial and critical success, spawning one of the most successful video game franchises of all time. By 2014, the franchise consisted of 18 games released over 19 years, with development shifting between various studios over time. Ghost Games was tasked with creating a formal reboot of the franchise, resulting in the 2015 game Need for Speed. And that's how we ended up with two Need for Speeds. Or is it Needs for Speed? Anyway, join me as I play through both of these games called Need for Speed, and I'll highlight what makes each of them notable before deciding which deserves to keep its name and which one is getting a new title. Before we begin, however, I have to warn you that these are racing games and police chases are a significant component, so there's lots of speedy movement and flashing lights. There's also a lot of other screen flashing and flickering on top of that, to the point that I found it very unpleasant, and I normally don't mind that kind of stuff. But with that out of the way, let's find out which of these games comes out on top, as there can be only one Need for Speed. Need for Speed is a racing game. You drive cars really fast and try to get to the finish before anyone else. And it's pretty good. I guess that's it, really. I mean, I'm going to keep rambling about it, but if you were just wondering whether or not it's worth a try, well, now you know. First of all, let's address the title of the game. Yeah, everybody just calls it Need for Speed, not least because that's what the franchise on the whole has been called, but this is the first game. They had no idea that it was going to grow into a franchise. The game's full legal name is Road and Track Presents The Need for Speed. As already mentioned, Road and Track is a car magazine for rail enthusiasts. It's kinda quaint that EA felt it'd be a good decision to partner up with a fairly obscure magazine, going so far as to put the magazine's title right in the name of the game. Different times. I guess Road and Track wasn't as strong a brand as John Madden. Anyway, the magazine specifically worked with EA to make sure the vehicle behavior and audio was realistic, but the magazine aesthetic bleeds into the game too. So you can look at all these nice photos of the cars alongside various statistics like horsepower and all that. I don't really care about this kind of stuff, I just like going fast, but it's a nice thing to include, and this is a fun way of presenting it. As I mentioned, the original game was an exclusive for the short-lived 3DO, and it included 3 point-to-point races. After about a year and a half, the game had been ported to MS-DOS, PlayStation, and Saturn, and those ports included 4 additional circuit races. Finally, the game was re-released as Road and Track Presents The Need for Speed Special Edition for both DOS and Windows 95. The Special Edition adds several improvements, including 2 new circuit races, additional settings, and 8-player networked multiplayer. So I'm not actually playing the original DOS port, I'm playing Special Edition on DOS, but other than the 2 new tracks, you wouldn't normally be able to tell the difference between the 2 games. Except wait, the original DOS game didn't play the music during the races? And the music is kind of great. Take a listen. Okay, let me turn the engine volume off. There, now have a listen. I don't think there's any song in this soundtrack that really blows my mind, but it's all really solid and totally fits the gameplay, and that makes it probably one of the better game soundtracks out there. Probably my biggest criticism is that most of the songs have the same instrumentation and feeling to them, so the result is that even though each song individually sounds fantastic, when they're played back to back throughout the game, they all kind of run together, and it starts to feel generic and bland, even though the songs definitely aren't generic or bland on their own. Because most songs are similar to each other, they have a hard time standing out, but that also means that the songs that do stand out really stand out. Now, what I really like about racing games are the environments. I'd say Need for Speed does a pretty good job on that front, but there are issues. Chief among them is just how limiting the tracks are. There's even less clearance than you'd guess at first glance. Even though it looks like you have more space than the road, there are invisible walls that keep you boxed in pretty tight. The second big issue is that most of the tracks in the game are multi-lap circuits. Thankfully, you can reduce the number of laps, but going around and around in a circle for minutes on end isn't really my idea of fun, and it saps the life and novelty out of environments that would otherwise be pretty good. In short, the highest praise that I can give this game's environments is that I want to jump the track and go exploring them, but the biggest criticism is that I very much cannot do that. The Alpine and Coastal point-to-point tracks are particularly good. They both provide a really good sense of going on a journey. See, a good journey requires 3 things. First, you need to end someplace very different from where you began. Second, the transition between those 2 places needs to feel natural. And third, there needs to be some interesting landmarks along the way. In Alpine, you start out near some farms, travel across a large bridge over a lake, pass through those mountainside semi-tunnel things, and the final leg of the race takes place in the snow. In Coastal, you begin near a nice coastal resort, speed through a hot air balloon festival, travel through a forest, and end up near a lone lighthouse. Along the way, you'll occasionally encounter police who want to slow you down. You can outrun them pretty easily, which you'll probably do anyway. You are racing after all. But if you make too many mistakes, they'll catch up, and they will not give up until you either escape or get your speeding ticket. In fact, that's all they care about, speeding. You can ram right into them or other cars, endangering the lives of everybody around, but they won't care about that. Game respects game, I suppose. The AI in this game is pretty tough. It doesn't feel like they're cheating, but they're very competent and consistent, so they give you a run for your money. One detail I absolutely love about them is that if you get too close in front of an opponent, they'll start honking at you. That's good stuff. Luckily, you don't have to be particularly good in this game, so the tough opponents aren't too big a deal. Except, hold on, where's the last track? Oh no. Yeah, one of the game modes is tournament mode, where you string together races in the different tracks and keep a running score. You have to finish first place on every track to unlock the full game. Yeah, I'm not doing that. The AI is tough and the circuit races are long. I'm just going to cheat and edit a file. Now that the game thinks I've won the tournament, I have access to the final map, Las Vegas. I don't think I was missing out on much. This is a nice idea, but I don't think they executed it very well. Maybe the technology just wasn't there for the proper Casino Planet look. Beating the tournament also unlocks mirrored and rally versions of each track. The rally versions cover the tracks in dirt, causing you to drift all over the place, but I don't think the AI is affected by it. It also turns the Wild West desert map into an Egyptian desert map for some reason. The drifting is super fun though, and beats even a lot of modern games' drifting handling. And the ultimate prize of tournament victory is a fictional rocket-powered car, which is really just straight up cheating. This would have been nice when I was trying to beat the tournament, not now that I've proven I don't need it. Oh well. It's an absolute blast on the rally track, slipping and sliding all over the place. Now, I did mention the multiplayer, but I didn't give it a go. It turns out that this 30-year-old game is kind of a pain to get running on modern hardware. It took me several hours before I first got the game to even work correctly, and then when I booted it up the next day, it didn't run anymore. After diving down another rabbit hole, I got it working again. Kinda. The first sign of trouble was stuttery audio. Once I got into the game, it ran extremely slowly. I mean, just look at the clock. It took me a couple more hours to get it working again, but now all the in-game cinematics were broken. I had found some people's fix for that, but that fix made the game look like this. I mean, this is kind of like cutting off your leg to stop your toe from hurting. Anyway, the point is that this seems like one of those older games that's just really fickle. Some people seem to get it running no problem whatsoever, while other people, like me, really have to wrangle with it. Now, it's worth noting that I am running the DOS version of the Special Edition, and maybe the Windows 95 version is easier to get working in an emulator, but I didn't try that. Either way, the bottom line is that getting this game to run properly for bog standard single player was tough enough, Getting 8-player LAN games going is an adventure for another time. So, what to make of Need for Speed? Well, there's not a lot to it. It's exactly what it appears to be at first glance. There are a decent number of environments and tracks, and a really solid soundtrack, and while the tournament mode gatekeeping is kind of disappointing, it's not that big a deal, not least because you can just cheat and get access to everything anyway. Overall, it's a perfectly fine, bite-sized racing game. Surprise bonus review! In 2014, EA announced that there would not be a new Need for Speed game that year, which was the first year without a Need for Speed game since 2001. But Need for Speed diehards weren't left completely empty-handed, because by pure coincidence, that was the year a film adaptation was released. And look at that, its name is just Need for Speed. Ah, geez, what to say about this movie? Well, it's not good, but you probably already could have guessed that. The story oscillates between being painfully predictable and totally nonsensical, but the worst part is just how gloomy the whole thing is. This should be a fun, exciting road trip and race combo adventure. It shouldn't be so emotionally overwrought. Why are you trying to depress the protagonist?
Why don't you just leave him?
Why is this scene in the movie?
I just did.
Toby, you guys good?
We need a hospital.
Find a hospital, find a hospital.
I'm working on it.
What's going on here?
Stay with her, all right?
I will.
Take care of her.
Come on, we gotta go.
Go.
Why are you doing this? Once the racing starts though, it actually gets pretty good. The car action looks fantastic, but the editing can make it hard to appreciate just what's going on. And even though it's an adaptation of racing games, which are almost always played in third person, there are a few first-person view shots in this movie. I guess that's just a requirement for adaptations of games. Even though these kinds of shots usually look super goofy, to say the least, in Need for Speed, they actually worked pretty well more often than not. And a few were even, dare I say, good shots. As with many other movies, the best part of Need for Speed is Michael Keaton, who surprises and delights as Monarch, an eccentric recluse with untold wealth who runs an annual illegal street race. He also runs a radio show, I think, that's all about his own race. Because this movie is as subtle as a brick flying through a window, Monarch intermittently pops in to recap the events of the movie right after we see them, except that the way he tells it is a lot more fun and engaging than the way that the movie does. You could cut this whole movie down to just the scenes that Monarch is in, and it'd only be maybe, 10 minutes long, but a vastly superior experience. Actually, that'd be kind of a neat idea for a short film, or maybe a radio play. Now, if you really want to watch a movie about going very fast with some questionable physics and good character work, Need for Speed actually has a recommendation for you.
Looks like a scene out of Speed down there. Hard left and 3 Keanu.
Good idea, let's stop watching this and put Speed on. But if you simply must have a cross-country trip from New York to California on a tight deadline, where the driver and the passenger start off somewhat hostile to each other but learn to respect and even admire each other by the end, while both the police and nondescript ne'er-do-wells chase after them, including an armed ambush in the desert and a daring rescue by aircraft, then Midnight Run is a much, much better choice. And it's got Joey Pants to boot. So, what to make of Need for Speed? Does this movie have its moments? Yes, absolutely.
Look into my eyes. Look into my eyes. Good. What color are they?
They're really blue.
They're really blue. Good. They're a lot bluer than yours.
No,
Yes, they are.
they're not.
Yes.
They're not bluer.
Admit it.
Mine are bluer.
Is it worth watching? No, probably not.
5.8 litre aluminium block, SVT supercharger and racing headers. Yeah, it's quite nice actually.
I wasn't expecting that.
Nor was I.
Now I know what you're wondering, and the answer is no. At no point does a character say the phrase, "Need for Speed." I'm not actually sure if the movie would have been better or worse if someone did say it. I mean, that's definitely the tone and energy the movie should have had, but that is not what we got. So anyway, this movie's definitely not good enough to be a contender for the name Need for Speed, so let's go ahead and give it a new name right now. Okay, so right from the get-go, we know that Toby is a good guy underdog, and Dino is a spoiled asshole who doesn't deserve what he has. The movie literally opens with a monologue from Monarch telling us exactly that. When we're actually introduced to Dino, the public loves him, but all the named characters hate his guts. He's the bad guy. Got it. As the movie progresses towards the finale, it just piles reason on top of reason for us and for the characters to hate him more and more. So even though there are 4 other racers and the cops get involved, we all know that Toby and Dino are the only ones who matter during the final race. Wait a second, the race takes them through a forest, out into the coast, and then ends at a lighthouse? Is this a reference to the coastal course from the first game? Anyway, this movie is all about the intense grudge between Toby and Dino, so the name is about as obvious as it gets. This movie should have been called Need for Speed Grudge Match. Alright, back to the games. Unlike the original game, this time around, we get a story. Kind of. The game has decided that there are 5 aspects of racing: speed, style, build, crew, and outlaw. At the beginning of the game, you meet 5 characters that each represent one of those disciplines, and in turn, they each worship a real-life icon of that discipline. As you complete races of each type, you catch the attention of that real-life icon, and by the end, you're best friends with everyone. Now, I have more to say about the story, but that can wait. Let's talk gameplay. Although the game tells you that there are 5 different types of racing, it really only offers 3. Go really fast, drift a lot, or go really fast and drift a lot. Sometimes cops get involved, but they can also show up outside of the outlaw races, and they're sort of non-entities anyway, because there's basically no way that you won't incidentally lose them while doing the race. The AI racers, in contrast, are completely absurd. I was never able to fully figure them out, but it's clear enough that there's some pretty wild rubber banding involved. Frequently, after completely wiping out, I'd find that my opponents all stopped and waited for me to recover. Very sporting of them. Other times, when I was really racing, they'd stay right on my ass and wouldn't give me an inch, so one small mistake would basically be unrecoverable. Even in the very first missions, where you're just driving from place to place with your new friends, winning is practically impossible. And I'm pretty confident that the AI does just straight up cheat. One race type is time attack, where you're put on a small circuit and you're given a few minutes to post the best lap time. Typically, the second lap will be significantly faster than your first, both because you now know the route and because you'll carry your first lap speed into the start of the second lap. I normally didn't have much trouble with these except for this fairly late game one. Even though I'm in the fastest car in the game, and even after a lap that I'd felt I'd have a hard time improving on, the AI would still beat me, and not by only a little. How? How on earth did they shave 2 seconds off my time? After a second failed attempt, I figured that my best bet was to post a decent lap time, then just turn around and spend the rest of the duration running interference against the other racers. And sure enough, even though my time was much worse than my previous attempts, it was still good enough to keep me in first place while I spent the rest of the time smashing into the opponents. At this point, you might have noticed that my driving is pretty sloppy. Well, I'm not going to act like I'm the greatest racer in the world, but I've played my fair share of racing games, and I'm normally not this bad. The handling in this game is just utter garbage. It might not be the absolute worst I've ever experienced, but it's definitely down there. Now, in a way, it is partly my fault. So you can finely tune the handling on each of your cars in the garage, but the problem is, I don't want to do that. Partly because it doesn't seem like fun to me, but mostly because the game makes it a huge pain in the ass to even try. Every time you want to make a change, you have to sit through a pretty lengthy loading screen going into and out of the garage, and then some menuing to get to the actual sliders you want to change, and even once you're there, the tooltips on what each slider actually does are simply not informative enough. Tuning your car correctly is basically a requirement in this game, but the game goes out of its way to make that difficult. Even their little guide at the top is pretty misleading. This isn't really a choice between drift versus grip. It's more like arcadey car versus freight train. At maximum grip, turning is practically impossible. Even after looking up a guide for tuning in this game, I got the cars to handle better, but still not great. I shouldn't have to put this much time, effort, and research into making the game not feel bad to play. The game developers are supposed to do that for me. What gives? Now that the car mostly behaved the way I wanted it to, more issues became apparent. A lot of the physics and handling in this game feel completely random. The things that I do to try to initiate a drift felt less like a technique and more like a superstitious ritual. Sometimes I'd pull off an amazing drift and it would feel incredible, and other times the car would refuse to turn at all and I would just plow straight into obstacles. Speaking of obstacles, there's traffic in this game. On paper, I'd say that's a good idea because it helps to sell the fantasy that I'm doing some illegal street racing, and it adds extra obstacles, making the races more interesting. But in practice, it's not so good. The AI opponents are pretty much completely unaffected by the traffic, but traffic can absolutely screw you over. Some of these people seem to have a vendetta against me. You might have also noticed that there are additional drivers on top of the racing opponents and random traffic. That's because this is an online game, and those are other players. Thankfully, there is an option to play alone, but you have to first load into an online game before you can use that option. Even in a solo session, though, the city is populated by AI players, and they still appear during your races. Does that mean in an online session, you could run into other players during your race? You know what other players do in online car games? They ram into you. Every time. Without fail. Remember how AIs in the original game would honk at you? Well, in this game, there is no honking. What? An online driving game with no honking? So literally the only interaction you can have with another player is ramming them? But traffic, handling, and other players aren't the only things that make your times unpredictable. In fact, the very start of each race seems to be pretty random. Sometimes you start out way ahead, sometimes in the pack, and sometimes way behind. And that's all within the same race. For that time attack race that was giving me so much trouble, I got lucky and started way ahead of the pack, meaning that my first lap was physically much shorter than all subsequent laps. Why did they do this? For drifting challenges, things get even stranger. To complete the challenge, you have to get a high enough drift score, and each drift you pull off is scored individually. What exactly dictates that score is beyond me. Sometimes lazily wobbling back and forth was worth it, and sometimes it wasn't. Usually, pulling off a wide, continuous drift would rack up the points, but not always. In theory, hitting a wall nullifies your drift so you don't get any of the points, and sometimes glancing scrapes would be enough to kill it, but other times full head-on collisions would be totally fine and I'd still get the points. The end result is that every single race in this whole game feels less like a matter of skill, learning the track, and getting comfortable with the car, and more like just a plain old coin toss. In this race, on my first attempt, it was just crash after crash. It was really dispiriting. But then on the second attempt, I breezed through the whole thing no problem, leaving my opponents so far behind that I didn't even see them for most of the race. Unlike the first game, the new Need for Speed takes place in an open-world city named Ventura Bay, which consists of 3 sections: downtown, some industrial warehouses and stuff, and a park isolated on its own island. Outside of the races, you can find snapshot vistas and donut spots. Unfortunately, they don't mean this kind of donut, they mean this kind. I don't really understand the point of these. They seem to be scattered pretty randomly throughout the map, and it's not like the game is asking you to do a donut someplace weird or exciting. It's always just some parking lot. As for the snapshots, those are a neat idea, but the execution is kind of pathetic. The bridge is the only snapshot location with any sense of aesthetic, and the rest are just random buildings and roads that are completely unremarkable. By now you might be wondering why I'm always driving at night. The answer is that I don't actually have a choice. This game does not feature a day-night cycle, instead tying the weather and time of day to location. It's always raining in downtown, and it's nighttime everywhere except for a couple spots where it's dusk. It's never daytime. I don't mind some night driving and racing, it can be very atmospheric, but nighttime all the time isn't any good. The result is that you can never see very much of the environment around you, which undoubtedly is the reason that they did this. The environments are very samey throughout the map, and even now after having played through the game, I still don't have a very good sense of which races take place in which areas. Even the park, which should be very different, actually feels pretty similar to the rest of the city because you're just staying on the very wide road and you can't see very much of the forest due to the constant darkness. The game also doesn't really make good use of the openness of its world. For example, taking the bridge into the city could be a really cool moment to put in a race, but it's completely ruined because you end up going into a tunnel, presumably to hide all the popping in of everything while it loads. Similarly, coming down from the mountain into the city is by far the best looking part of the game, not least because of the evening light, but the road isn't even arranged in a way to show off the spectacle of your approach. All the races in the game take place on routes that actually exist in the open world, but as I mentioned, Ventura Bay doesn't have much variety, and on top of that, it's not very large, nor particularly sprawling. As a result, you'll be driving over the same exact roads over and over again in races that are only technically different. To make matters worse, some sets of races in the story explicitly send you on the same routes several times in a row. Why? Let's talk about the music. The only part of the soundtrack that's original plays during cop chases, and it's unbelievably boring ambient music that really doesn't fit at all. Now, this kind of music works great as a build-up, but it's playing during the chase. There's nothing for it to build up to. The rest of the music in the game are all licensed songs. Some of it's pretty good. Some of it I found just flat out annoying after the first or second listen. But the majority of it is aggressive in a really bland and kind of unpleasant way. This game's soundtrack suffers from a similar problem to the original game's soundtrack. Even though these songs are much more tolerable on their own, when they're played together back to back during the gameplay, they all kind of run together into a sort of unpleasant, overly aggressive mush. As a result, there are songs in here that I normally wouldn't be super interested in, but because they provide some much needed variety, I'd breathe a sigh of relief every time they'd come on.
I got 25 reasons why you should not be my girl.
Tragically, some of the best songs in the game only play in your garage, even though in my opinion, several of them would be much better suited to racing than most of the racing songs. And now, as promised, I'll return to talking about the story. At the start of the game, we meet Spike, who we just raced, and he invites us to meet his friends. Then the closest thing to a second plot point that this game has is that there's an outlaw who's just shown up, and he's stirring up the proverbial hive, which is putting everyone on edge.
Sooner they get busted, the better.
Why do you care?
Because it's got people tripping.
People don't spend money when they're nervous, man.
And that doesn't really go anywhere, so I just spoiled the entire story for you. Despite the complete lack of plot, there's almost an hour's worth of cutscenes and plenty of in-game phone dialogue on top of that. All of the phone calls and cutscenes gave me a particular kind of feeling. Like, we all meet up at the club, then drive over to a second location at the diner, then over to a second location at the local bar, then people calling each other and inviting everyone to their respective hangout spots. Sometimes people couldn't make it, though they never specified why, so we'd split up and hang out with some people separate from the others, then we'd all regroup again at the diner, and on and on and on it goes. Because the entire game takes place at night during both cutscenes and gameplay, and because nobody ever changes clothes, it feels like the whole game is just one long night out that would not end. I've had nightmares like this. I think these cinematics are pretty great, and that's exclusively because of the actors, who are frankly astonishing. I think the writing is absolutely terrible, and on paper, most of this dialogue should sound so put on and forced that it would make Life is Strange sound naturalistic.
I hope you checked the perimeter, as my step-ass would say. Now, let's talk business.
I got nothing for you.
Wrong. You got hella cash.
Except that the actors are so good that they actually managed to make their characters seem believable.
No, I was maxing at the diner, and I caught this hype, some asshat train on the freeway. Guess my invite got lost, yeah?
Didn't think it was your scene.
It ain't. Well, you keep it real classy, yeah? I'm out.
Forget him. He's just jelly. So anyway.
I think it's kind of easy to miss just how good they are, but in a few late game scenes where the real life racers say a couple lines, the difference between them and the actors is pretty stark.
Watch this. Risky devil hash coming right out!
Cook put us up to it.
Oh, really? Piggy masks? What are you trying to say?
Honestly, you're the designated divider of the pizza. What can I say?
These are the guys I wanted you to meet.
What's up, dude? Seen your moves. Killing it.
True that, bro?
Yeah, but if you're serious about mobbing with these dudes, you gotta get more street cred. You gotta bust up that chassis.
Yep.
Destroy those wheels.
Bang limiter and shred those tires.
Yeah!
You think you're ready for that?
I like the characters. It's uncanny how much this guy looks like someone I went to high school with. Although there are a few moments of friction, it's always brushed off really quickly, and overall, the cutscenes are just about everybody hanging out and getting along. Actually, I said I like the characters, but I don't like Travis. He gives me the heebie-jeebies. I particularly don't like how he's hanging out and drinking with people who are clearly much younger than him, and how he keeps putting his arm around the women. Yeah, I'm only getting bad vibes from Travis. But everyone else is cool, and again, the actors do a great job of making them charming and believable, even when the script they're working with didn't make that an easy task.
When did our balls drop off?
Real.
Man, you never had balls.
Oh, really? Then what you busting all this time, man? Huh? Yo ass. God, man.
As the game progressed, I found myself getting really fatigued with it rather quickly. Well before the halfway mark, I felt like I had seen everything the game had to offer, but I soldiered onwards basically just because I wanted to see the cutscenes. But due to how repetitive and difficult the races get in the later stages of the game, I was really struggling to, bam, disconnected. Yeah, I already mentioned that this game will put you into online sessions with other players, and unfortunately, this is an online-only game. I intended to manually test what happens when you disconnect from their servers mid-game by just unplugging my computer from the internet, but I didn't have to. EA did it for me. Twice. So yeah, this game is dead when their servers shut down. It will cease to exist. No part of it will be playable at all. Apparently, a couple years back, they'd take the servers down for maintenance on almost an hourly basis. Hourly. Some players reacted to that the same way that medieval peasants would regard comets. It isn't nearly so bad now, and besides, EA is like a serial killer. They like to post their kills in a nice alphabetized list ahead of time. So it's a safe bet that they won't kill this game for another couple months at least, but it's by no means guaranteed. So yeah, I didn't bother to finish this game. It just wasn't worth it. I guess I should have been clued in when I saw that the main menu tip suggested that if I wasn't having fun, it's actually my fault. I mean, what does it say about the game that the developers felt the need to include that in the main menu? So I grabbed the remaining few cutscenes I had yet to see off the internet, and the final cutscene isn't much of a payoff, but overall, I'd say the general mood of the game's story is right where it should be. No, it doesn't really make much sense, but it doesn't have to, because it's primarily about a bunch of people getting together and driving cars and having fun, and ultimately supporting each other's successes. This is what the film should have been like. So, what to make of Need for Speed? Well, it starts off really promising, and there are a lot of elements that sound great on paper. But every single thing I want to like about it is done kind of terribly. Yeah, I want to go exploring and driving in an open world, but I want it to be large and actually varied and not constantly nighttime. Yeah, I'd like places to visit and things to do in that open world, but I want those places to be visually interesting and the activities to be at least somewhat engaging. Yeah, I want different types of races, but I want them to actually be different instead of just go fast or do drifts. And I want the handling to fit the type of race that I'm doing instead of being absolutely uncontrollable. Yeah, I want long races that span the open world, but I want those races to give me a good sense of a journey. Yeah, I want cops to try to put a stop to my illegal street racing, but I want them to be a more meaningful part of the game instead of something that I could just as easily completely ignore. These are all good ideas, and EA probably knew that because Ubisoft's The Crew pulled all of those off much better, and it came out a year before Need for Speed. The only thing that Need for Speed does better is its story, which is leaps and bounds better than The Crew's. These cinematics are far and away the best part of the game, and they were really the only reason that I kept playing as long as I did. Well, there we have it. We've seen what the Needs for Speeds are offering. So, which one comes out on top? Well, I don't think there's any contest here. The original is Need for Speed. The new one is just too repetitive, the music is much worse, the handling and physics are unpredictable and frustrating, and while the cinematics do add a lot, they just aren't enough. Neither game really has much substance to it, but at least the original doesn't pretend that it does. The new Need for Speed stretches its few environments out across so many races that it feels thin and extremely repetitive. Wait, why am I even bothering to compare the two? The new Need for Speed doesn't even really exist. It's just a mirage. As soon as EA decides to shut the servers down, that game will vaporize into thin air. I mean, you could buy a copy of the game today, and for all we know, you'd never be able to play it because EA could pull the plug as you download it. So what should the new one be called instead? Well, you probably saw this one coming. Need for Speed Online. There's no game here, just temporary access to a program running on EA's server. In fact, it isn't even the first online-only Need for Speed. All the way back in 2001, EA released Motor City Online, which was originally developed as a Need for Speed game until they decided to scrap the single-player element and make it online only. That game only lasted 2 years before permanent destruction. Then in 2010, EA released Need for Speed World as part of their turn-of-the-decade trend of free-to-play, online-only, microtransaction-heavy games. I actually remember playing that one for a bit. I enjoyed it alright for what it was, and it was one of the earlier open-world driving games I got my hands on, but I also didn't spend any money on it, so it's not like I could experience very much of what it had to offer. EA killed that game just before its 5th birthday, but the community has since reverse-engineered a server for it called Soapbox Race World. Well, we can only hope that Need for Speed Online receives the same treatment. Other than the cutscenes, which actually will survive the game's destruction just fine, there's nothing I particularly like about this game, but damn it, that doesn't mean it should be destroyed. People put a lot of time and effort into this thing, and just because I don't like it, doesn't mean that it's completely irredeemable. There is no doubt in my mind that this is somebody's favorite game of all time, and that there will be people in the future who would have loved to play it, but they won't be able to. And there's really no excuse for this. The original Need for Speed is no longer for sale anywhere, but it has fully functional multiplayer. Sure, it takes some work to get the multiplayer running, because that game is from 1994 and modern hardware and operating systems didn't exist yet, but I'm not asking for the new Need for Speed to be able to run flawlessly on technology that hasn't been invented yet. I'm just asking for it to exist at all in the future, even if it'll only run on the primitive hardware of today. But wait, we're not done yet. A franchise this long running, you can bet that Need for Speed isn't the only offender. Although Need for Speed 2 didn't feature police in any capacity, EA decided to incorporate police chases as a core part of 1998's Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit. It received a direct sequel 4 years later with Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2, and a reboot in 2010 just called Need for Speed Hot Pursuit. So let's check them out, as there can be only one Need for Speed Hot Pursuit. Much like the original Need for Speed, there's not a whole lot going on in Hot Pursuit. You pick a car, pick a track, race to the finish, and that's pretty much it. The handling, however, is very different, and I'd say the physics across the board are just straight up worse. For once, I think the wonky handling actually does come across in the video. See how the cars sort of slide around rather than swivel, and how all non-player vehicles, including the Taffic, sort of wobble side to side for some reason? Also, whenever you collide with something, be that a wall or another vehicle, your car tends to stick to whatever you've hit like a magnet. The result is that trying to overtake someone is super difficult, and trying to recover from slamming into a wall is way more work than it ought to be. The other obvious downgrade from the first game is the soundtrack. Now don't get me wrong, it's definitely not bad, but it's not particularly great either. Each race has 2 songs, a techno and a rock song, and while they all fit the gameplay, they're just a little too repetitive for me to particularly like them, and they don't have half the personality of the soundtrack of Need for Speed. The songs also change dynamically based on how fast you're going, and while I think that's a fun gimmick, in practice the only time you're going to notice it is when there's a really jarring shift because of a collision. Unsurprisingly, my favorite part of the game by far is its environments. Although definitely still limited by the technology of the time, these tracks are filled with personality and neat landmarks, like the skeleton of a massive creature that you drive through in the canyon, the underground temple out in the desert, the underwater aquarium tunnel, and a ski lift that you can see the top and bottom of on the mountain track. The game is also filled with location-specific ambient sounds, like cows mooing in the barns, or a bell ringing in a church, or a saw whirring in a lumber mill. The game includes 4 different environments, namely the small town, the desert, the mountain, and a near-future coastal city. Each environment has 2 tracks, and those tracks explicitly overlap. You can see the closed-off roads that you drive on in the alternate version. The alternate tracks also differentiate themselves by either being snowy or evening. On that note, you can decide to drive any track at night or with weather enabled, and you also have options to play tracks backwards or mirrored. I was really surprised just how different a track felt by taking it backwards, and additionally mirroring it, making it nighttime, and enabling the weather made it genuinely feel like an entirely new track. These options seem kind of minor, but they give the game a huge boost in replayability, and they help to keep things feeling fresh. Speaking of options, the game provides so-called driving assists to make playing the game easier. The traction one claims to improve handling, but I honestly didn't notice a difference, and I similarly couldn't tell what collision recovery was supposed to do. The braking assist will slam the brakes for you near turns, which is both exactly what I need to race better, and exactly what I don't want, because I like careening into turns at full speed. The navigator gives you instructions for what's ahead of you on the course.
Hard right. Medium right. Medium left.
And the best line assist shows you the supposed best path to take across the course by demarking it with cones. Now again, I'm not going to claim to be an expert racer, but I would definitely challenge the notion that what it lays out is always the best way to go. In any case, even though I basically ignored it, I like to keep this option on because the cones pop off the road when you hit them, and the game even provides a counter for how many you've hit. Unfortunately, those assists are only available in the single race game mode, and as you might have guessed, there are a few cars and a bonus track locked off behind progress in the other game modes. God forbid you let basic accessibility options actually make the game more accessible. Now I've already mentioned that I like the environments a lot, but I like the tracks themselves too. Their layouts are fun and varied, and they give you a lot of aesthetic variety. Take Hometown. You start out near some farms, take some covered bridges, pass by a church and a water wheel, zoom through the local town, then out into a forest, across a highway, and you're back at the farms. Yeah, that's the big downside of all the tracks. Despite being fairly lengthy and having nice variety to them, every single one is a circuit race with a minimum of 2 laps. 2 of the game modes, Knockout and Tournament, play out almost exactly the same as each other. You have to race through all 8 tracks in a row, getting first in each race in order to get the unlocks. The primary difference is that all the races are 2 laps in Knockout, but 4 laps in Tournament. No thanks. Luckily, this game has cheat codes. Bam! All cars in the bonus track unlocked. The bonus track is called Empire City, and I think this is probably the weakest track in the game. The most interesting part of it is something that I completely missed my first time playing, which is the big off-brand Death Star up in the sky. The level is otherwise fairly lacking in personality, in my opinion. The game also has 5 additional tracks that are only unlockable using cheat codes, but tragically, these are all exclusive to the PlayStation version of the game. Cavern and Autocross look kinda bland, and while Space Race, Scorpio 7, and The Room are fun concepts, the tracks themselves don't seem that interesting. So in a way, I'm not really missing out on much, but I still don't really get why you'd cut out a third of your game and hide it behind cheat codes and locked to only one platform. The final game mode is the game's namesake, which has you racing through the track as usual, but now there are cops who will chase after you. If you keep the pursuit up for long enough, they'll start deploying roadblocks and spike strips. It's appropriate that they named the game after this specific game mode. It's far and away the most fun one. The inclusion of police scanner chatter pumps up the cool factor by at least 10 times. The cops will even specifically name your car, its color, your speed, and your location on the map. Unfortunately, it's pretty easy to just ignore the cops outright, even in the slower cars, and the traffic is too sparse to really matter, even after using a cheat that ostensibly makes it more dense. You can also flip the script and play as the cop, trying to force all the cars to stop so you can ticket them. It's always neat when games let you play as the bad guys, but this time around, it isn't as fun as it sounds. You can't actually wreck the cars, so getting them to slow down long enough for you to issue the ticket can be kind of tedious. So what to make of Need for Speed Hot Pursuit? Well, it's pretty good. Compared to the original Need for Speed, it feels like it's simultaneously much better and much worse. The graphics and technical limitations are much less restrictive, so the game has way better environments, and those are by far my favorite part. But the handling and physics are much jankier, which is obviously going to hamper the entire experience. And while the titular game mode is a really cool idea, and they nail the aesthetics of it, mechanically it's not really different from just normal racing, because the cops are basically irrelevant. The biggest departure that Hot Pursuit makes from Hot Pursuit is that much like Need for Speed Online, all the races take place in a big open world consisting of 3 environments. Except these 3 environments are actually noticeably different from one another: the mountain, the forest, and the desert. Also, instead of simply picking a race and doing it, you now have to play the races in a specific order to unlock them all, and to unlock more than just one car. I don't really know why they did this, and I don't like it. I'd rather be able to just play the damn game. So I'll go ahead and tell you now, as a result, I didn't play much of this game. If they had just given me a free choice of race, game mode, and car, I undoubtedly would have played a lot more. Instead, they decided to restrict it all, and I don't think they made good choices. The other major issue is, again, something that this game has in common with Need for Speed Online. These tracks all feel the same as each other, and it's not just that any one desert track feels like the other desert tracks. The layouts of all the roads across all the environments feel very samey. Now, in fairness, the environments have more interesting details in them than I first thought. There's a lot to find and look at, like weird rock formations, big waterfalls, a ski lift, a visitor center, a knockoff very large array, some fancy lakeside housing, a dam, an old country town and fort, and an airfield, just to name a few. The problem is that all of those are extremely background and super easy to miss during a race, which is quite unlike all the set dressing from the original Hot Pursuit. Actually, I found all of those details while in Freeroam and not in a race. I'm honestly not entirely sure why this game even has free roaming. There's nothing to do. Other than the clearly marked shortcuts, you can't even leave the roads. Invincible fences keep you boxed in. Sure, I enjoyed finding those little details that I otherwise would have missed, and I liked how atmospheric the dynamic weather and time of day were, but the map just isn't big enough for sustained exploration. I just wish there was a little more to it. I mean, you can't even open the map while free roaming. But hey, this is a racing game, not a driving game, so what about the races? Well, they're fun. Super fun, in fact. Although it took me a bit, once I was accustomed to the game's handling, drifting felt absolutely fantastic. The more recklessly you drive, the faster your nitrous fills, so you'll be drifting, swerving near cars, and driving on the wrong side of the road to fill it up as fast as possible. And even if you mess up, there's a great payoff. The crashes in this game are spectacular. This is some carnage that will never ever get old. Good thing too, because playing as a cop is all about causing crashes. I like how every cop car is fitted with NOS.
All interceptor response cars are fitted with an SCPD nitrous system.
Yeah, this game really rides the line between propaganda and satire. Yep, issued a warning. Ultimately, as with the other Hot Pursuit, I don't think the cop game modes are really as fun as normal racing, though this time around they are a nice little diversion. Actually, some of the cop missions literally are just normal races, only you get a penalty for hitting stuff. Meh. Well, I talked about the music for all the other games so far, so I might as well go over the music in this one. It's all licensed music, but unlike Need for Speed Online, it fits the game pretty well, and it doesn't instantly get old. Honestly, for the most part, I didn't really notice it while playing, so overall I'd say it's good, but unremarkable, with a few standout songs. One last thing worth mentioning is that what I've been showing you here is not, in fact, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit. In actuality, it's Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Remastered. I'll be damned if you could tell. As far as I can see, the only noticeable differences between the original and the remaster are the disk space, which went up by about 200%, and the price tag, which went up 50%. Okay, I guess the contrast is a little better in the remaster, but it still isn't great. So, what to make of Need for Speed Hot Pursuit? Well, I definitely liked it. I really enjoyed the more fleshed out cop mechanics and the arcadey feel to the whole thing. The problem is that maybe after only 5 tracks or so, the game becomes really monotonous. And that's what really gets me about this level design. They're having to make all these concessions so that the tracks work as a coherent, interconnected open world, and then they give you literally nothing to do in it other than those races that suffer from the open world design. Unless you really like the idea of doing practically the exact same race over and over and over again, there just isn't enough variety or personality in the game's tracks to justify slogging through them to unlock more races and more cars. And there we have it. We've seen what the Need for Speed Hot Pursuits are offering. So, which one comes out on top? Honestly, this was a really tough one for me. By basically every metric, I'd say the second game is outright better, except for the tracks themselves. The environments in the original game have way more character and personality, and the tracks tend to have more interesting and memorable layouts. As a result, even though it only has 9 tracks to the new game's 100 or so, the older game feels like it has tons more substance to it. But mechanically, the second game is just so much more fun. The handling and physics are right where they should be, and the game modes are executed much better. Alright, fine, I concede. The new game is Hot Pursuit. Even though its environments and tracks are a letdown, the gameplay is just much better. Now we have the issue of renaming the original game. Okay, first, can we all just agree that the new game should have been called Hot Pursuit 3, right? I mean, it's the third Hot Pursuit game. That should have been its name. Now, I know that's not the rules of the game we're playing here, but I just wanted to get that off my chest before renaming the first game. Well, the cleanest change would just be lopping off the subtitle and leaving this game as Need for Speed 3. But that's boring. I don't want fewer subtitles, I want more. The more the merrier, right? Well, the best part of this game is its environments, and it has way more variety and substance than the new game. So how about Need for Speed Hot Pursuit Around the World? Yeah, it really should have a few more environments than it does to live up to that name, but for a 1998 game, I think it's close enough. But we're still not done yet. 2 pairs of games with the same name is not enough for EA. There are also 2 games named Need for Speed Most Wanted, The first developed by EA Black Box and released in 2005, and the second also developed by Criterion and released in 2012. So let's dive in, as there can be only one Need for Speed Most Wanted.
Hi, I'm Josie Marin, and I play Mia in Need for Speed Most Wanted. Make sure you do all your racing in the game. On the streets, drive safely and responsibly, and wear your seatbelt.
Hey, you know what that means? Cutscenes. Here, this is literally the second line in the entire script.
First, I'm gonna take your ride, then I'm gonna take your girl. Get ready for that.
So yeah, this game doesn't waste time establishing its tone. It also introduces you to a couple of the local cops with some truly inspired editing. There are a few things here that jump out immediately. First of all, this game is extremely ugly. And I'm not referring to how the graphics are a little dated. I'm talking about how the whole game is mucus colored. Sometimes it's a snotty yellow, other times it's a slimy green. The cutscenes are color graded similarly, and they're also really blurry and bloomy. It looks terrible. Also, I really dislike how blurry the game gets once you hit a certain speed. I mean, I'm all for making it feel like I'm going faster than I actually am, but this is just excessive. Another thing that stands out is how every single woman in this game is showing off their midriff. Every one, even the cop. I don't mind women dressing and acting sexy, but come on, this is just embarrassing. And the last thing that stands out is just how good these cutscenes are. On top of the great editing, I think these actors do a pretty good job. I mean, these are not nuanced or subtle performances, but they're hamming it up competently. This line is so good that they give it to you twice, as well they should.
First, I'm gonna take your ride, then I'm gonna take your girl. Get ready for that.
The opening few races have you racing a top-of-the-line car, making them really easy to win. In fact, all you really need to do is use your nitrous at the very start, and you'll put yourself so far ahead that the other racers don't stand a chance. But at the end of the prologue, the villain, Razor, sabotages your car so that he wins the race and you go to jail. To add insult to injury, Razor also takes your car as his prize. After some time in jail, Mia comes to pick us up. She's, pretty courageous to be driving like that right in front of the precinct, but okay.
Get in.
Wait a second.
Get in!
Now that we're out, we decide it's time to take revenge on Razor by racing our way up the blacklist.
If you want to take out Razor and get your ride back, you got a lot of work to do. You have to work your way up the blacklist and take out everyone on the way. Pick the right event, get enough bounty, and you can challenge a ranked racer. Once they're all out of the way, Razor's all yours. Cool?
Unfortunately, the cutscenes pretty much stop here. The game has about 15 minutes of live action footage, and 10 of them are in the prologue. Anyway, we buy a crappy car and get racing. In order to confront each blacklist rival, we first need to complete races and police pursuit milestones that they challenge us with to prove that we're worth their time. We also need to have a suitably high bounty with the local cops. Unlike some of the other Need for Speed games, Most Wanted is really more about slowing down for corners rather than drifting through them. While I do prefer the drifting, that's really just a matter of taste, and I like these kinds of racing games too. I mean, it's still far from realistic, and you can kinda drift into turns if you're going really fast. It's just nothing like the power sliding of some of the other entries. There are a few different types of races, but really all but one of them boil down to get to the finish fast. Okay, I guess the speed trap one is also slightly different. There are several checkpoints throughout the race, and each one takes a snapshot of your current speed as you drive through it. At the end of the race, your score is a total of your speed at each of those checkpoints. This means that finishing first is actually not as important as going at a higher speed through each individual checkpoint. This gives the player an enormous advantage because you can just hit your NOS right before the checkpoints and come out dozens of points ahead of your opponents every single time. Anyway, the other type of race that actually is different is the drag race. Unlike actual drag racing, these still take place on roads with twists and turns, but you as the player don't actually perform those turns. Now you can switch lanes, but otherwise the steering is entirely handled by the game, and you have control over acceleration and nitrous, and unlike all the other races, you have to manually shift gears up and down. Because the drag races are so short, you have to carefully manage your nitrous, switch lanes strategically, and have good timing when shifting your gears. These are honestly pretty fun, and they're a nice change of pace from the other types of races. As for the pursuit milestones, I generally found them pretty easy to obtain. Sometimes a rival would demand 2 milestones that were mutually exclusive, meaning that you'd have to engage in more than one police pursuit in order to get them both, but that's okay. I found the pursuits themselves to actually be pretty enjoyable. Once the cops are on you, you can't really just totally ignore them, you do have to at least try to lose them. And the game assists you with certain buildings that you can ram to take down pursuing cars. I don't know how many times I destroyed this donut shop or blew up this gas station. I feel like this kind of escalates me from illegal street racer, maybe even all the way up to domestic terrorist, but none of that actually appears on my rap sheet, so I guess it's no big deal. I still have no idea what it takes to get reckless driving or speeding added to my rap sheet. I mean, I was definitely speeding, and this seems about as reckless as driving can get, but apparently the cops think otherwise. When the time comes to actually race against a rival, they're almost certainly going to be in a car that outclasses yours, and the AI generally doesn't pull any punches. Once you've defeated a rival, you can choose 2 rewards from 6 options, 3 of which are random. One of those random 3 is the opponent's car, and that's really what you want, but, well, it's random. Once one rival is down, it's on to the next one with more races and milestones for you to complete, and the game continues like that through to the end. At first, the game pretty much progressed as I was expecting. The races ramped up a little in difficulty and complexity, and before long, it was time to race rival number 3, or I guess number 13 on the blacklist. That was when I started to see some cracks. Up to this point, even the difficult races were still totally doable, and whenever I'd need to restart a race, I felt like I knew where I needed to improve in order to win. A shortcut I didn't take, or a turn I flubbed, something like that. That was not the case with this guy. Even though I was using the souped up car of the previous rival, I just could not stay ahead. In the end, I only beat him on his first race by forcing him off the road at the start, at which point I think his AI didn't really know what to do. You can see on the minimap that he just kind of stayed there. And I was lucky that I was even able to force him off the road because, for whatever reason, your car doesn't have much of an impact on the other cars in this game. Sure, they can ram into you and completely screw you over, but you can only ram into them with all the strength of a stiff breeze. But my luck ran out eventually, and it looks like the rival just respawned on the road after a while. Now, as I said, I did beat him, but even though I effectively had a 20-second head start and I didn't make any major mistakes throughout the run, the rival was not at all that far behind me by the end. As for the second race, I had no such luck trying to ruin his run. This was just a matter of racing well, and it was tough. Even on a run that I was pretty happy with, he still beat me by 0.03 of a second. So I kept restarting and restarting and restarting, grinding away until eventually I shaved 15 whole seconds off my time and I finally beat him, though he was still right behind me. Luckily, I won his car from the random rewards, and judging from his performance, I thought this might make me practically unstoppable. But nope, the races kept ramping up in difficulty. I mean, they weren't nearly as bad as that rival, but they were really giving me a hard time, and in order to progress, you need to get first place in every race. Anything less, and the next rival won't be interested. And that's particularly rough because these races tend to be kind of long. You may spend 3 or 4 minutes only to mess up at the very end, get overtaken, and have to redo the whole thing. Now maybe you're thinking that all I need to do is buy a faster car or buy parts to upgrade my car. Okay, that's a nice idea, but let's run the numbers. The junk car that I bought at the start of the game cost $30,000, and it did fine for the first couple races, but was severely outclassed by the second rival's car. Every single one of the races that I'd been doing so far came with a cash reward of $2,000, so to break even on that first car that I had to buy, I need to do 15 races. That's kind of a lot. Sure, races against rivals offer more, but not by all that much. When I finally beat that third rival, the random rewards I got were his car and a $15,000 bonus. That bonus was nearly 1/3 of all the money that I had made up to that point, including the $10,000 bonus that I won off the first rival, and I hadn't spent a dime yet. Not least because cars and parts require beating Blacklist rivals to even have the option to purchase them. And that's really the worst part of this game, grinding for that next rival. As I previously mentioned, on top of the races and milestones that you have to complete, you also need a high enough bounty on you. As far as I know, the only way to increase your bounty is to get into pursuits and escape. A typical pursuit might net a few thousand bounty, and if I really try to go for that bounty and prolong the pursuit to 5 or more minutes, I might get 8,000 bounty or so. So how much do I need for these early rivals? Well, for that rival number 3 that gave me so much trouble, I needed a whopping 100,000 bounty, 50,000 more than what I needed for rival number 2. By the end of the game, in order to face against Razor again, you need 10 million bounty, and that's 2.5 million more than the previous rival. 2.5 million! Yeah, completing the rival's listed milestone gives you a hefty bonus, but they're never enough on their own. You have to grind out these pursuits. To make matters worse, as you probably have noticed, all the races that you're required to do take place in the open world, and it just is not large or varied enough to support that. By only the 4th rival, I must have driven down the same exact roads dozens of times. On top of that, the map is restricted to only one so-called borough at the start of the game, chopping the already unimpressive size of the map down to just 1/3. The second borough is unlocked by defeating rival number 3, meaning you have to win an absolute minimum of 17 races before the game offers you a new environment. And even then, the prerequisite races for the next rival are still primarily located in the borough that you started in. Come on! Not that that's even a big loss, because other than a few notable areas, the new borough barely feels any different. And for an additional layer of monotony, the game only features 16 licensed songs during the races. Some of it is fine, but gets old on repeat listens. A couple of the songs are actually pretty good. And a lot of them are just annoying. There's a lot more metal in here than some of the other games, and some of it is great. But some of it is just way too edgy and whiny for me to like it at all. Once again, the pursuit music is all original, and once again, it's pretty bland. Most of it is fairly generic up-tempo orchestral music with some electric guitar playing in the background. It's not bad, but it's not good either. Look, I wanted to play through this whole game, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to keep pushing through this monotony. The racetracks are simply too boring, the environment barely changes, and there's nothing to do in the open world other than grind for bounty. So what to make of Need for Speed Most Wanted? Well, it's one of the ugliest games I've ever seen. It drags on and on with horrible grinding, its open world is kind of barren, and all of its races feel exactly the same as one another, not least because they constantly reuse the same exact streets and routes. Generally speaking, I don't like circuit races and racing games because I don't want to drive in circles seeing the same thing over and over again. But because Most Wanted only has a handful of different routes that it forces you to repeat in over 100 races before getting to the end, That's exactly what the whole game feels like. One long circuit race. New cars are prohibitively expensive, and on top of that, you need to beat Blacklist rivals to even have the opportunity to buy them. So you don't have the room to experiment or try new things, and I can't imagine you'll be able to buy more than 3 or 4 cars throughout the entire game. Most Wanted feels less like an actual game and more like a decent demo that was stretched out until it was paper thin, making it extremely repetitive and deeply unsatisfying after only a couple hours. Okay, at this point you should kinda know the drill. It's a racing game, cops will chase you sometimes, and once again, they sacrifice inventive track layouts and environments in favor of a coherent and totally bland open world. Look, I've been talking about the Need for Speed franchise non-stop for what, just over an hour now? Can I just take a break real quick? Talk about something else? Like, how about the reason that I'm reviewing all these games back to back? Originally, I had just intended to talk about the 2 Most Wanted games because I knew I could get my hands on them. The original Most Wanted is Abandonware, and the new one I had actually played a little before, though I have literally no recollection of that, and playing the game again didn't jog any memories. I had gotten it during Origin's short-lived On the House program, where EA would temporarily make a game free to keep. I guess they were trying to get people to jump ship from Steam onto Origin, and they did make some pretty good games available for free, but after 35 games across 4 years, they shuttered the program, and a few years ago, EA capitulated and started returning to Steam. Epic Games Store is pulling off a similar stunt these days with free-to-keep games every single week, and there have been some really excellent games offered by that. As it happens, that's how I got Psychoshock. Originally, they only intended to offer a free game every 2 weeks until the end of 2019, but this increased to a free game every week in June, and then quietly continued into 2020 and beyond. Their FAQ has changed to imply that they'll continue offering free games every week for the foreseeable future. As for the other Need for Speed games, I knew that the 2 old ones were both abandonware and would therefore be pretty easy to obtain. The new Hot Pursuit would have been a bit of a speed bump, but not too bad. But Need for Speed Online posed a serious problem because, well, it's online only. You can't play without having an authenticated connection to EA servers, so piracy and cracks are literally not possible. That's exactly why the game is doomed to cease existing. If it were piratable like the old Need for Speed games, then it would continue to exist indefinitely. I wasn't interested in dropping money on these games to own them, so I didn't. And in fact, I still don't own them. See, a while back I received a promotional 3 months free of the Xbox Game Pass, and EA's similar subscription EA Play comes included. So I figured it was now or never, and while I was here, I decided to expand the episode to include all the Need for Speed games with the same name. Anyway, despite being useful for me in this particular instance, I can't say I'm a fan of the Game Pass. Fundamentally, you're paying money for the privilege of not owning games, which is actually something you can do for free. Now, I'm not knocking people who do like the Game Pass, but I'm always going to be, at a minimum, very skeptical of companies that are asking people to pay to not own stuff. And unlike other subscription services, like streaming for music, television, or movies, temporary access to games isn't something you can just turn into a permanent archive. Like, if you're watching a streaming exclusive show, there is literally nothing that anyone can do to make it impossible to record that show, and now it's preserved for forever. Even once your subscription ends, the show is pulled, or the service shuts down entirely. There isn't really a difference between a show and a recording of that show, and the same goes for movies and music, but not for games. Temporary access to games is pretty much worthless, and that's why these companies are trying so hard to get people to subscribe. Microsoft with their Game Pass, EA with EA Play, Ubisoft with Ubisoft Plus, and let's not forget Ubisoft claiming that the Trackmania Online 2020 demo didn't feature a subscription, it just had paid temporary access that you had to renew. Anyway, far and away the most successful game subscription service out there is the Xbox Game Pass. But so much about it really gives me pause. First of all, EA Play is included as part of the Game Pass subscription, but EA Play is half the price of the Game Pass, and it includes a discount on all EA games if you choose to actually purchase them. To me, this suggests that Microsoft is giving EA pretty close to half of all the subscription money, because otherwise EA wouldn't be interested in attaching itself to the Game Pass. I've heard some people suggest that the Game Pass is good for indie games. Really? You think that Tendershoot, the devs behind Hypnospace Outlaw, are getting anything more than peanuts compared to EA or Ubisoft? I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of people who have only been exposed to some great indie games because of the Game Pass, and that is genuinely a great thing, but I doubt it's financially beneficial for indie devs to join the pass. And really, that strikes at the heart of the biggest problem for me with the Game Pass. Microsoft has absolutely stuffed it full of their own games, and their upcoming flagship game Starfield is going to be available on the Game Pass from day one. What? Regardless of how good that game ends up being, there is an enormous amount of hype behind it, so there's absolutely no way that you could convince me that the new subscriptions it may draw in are going to outweigh the money lost from initial actual sales of the game, particularly because opening sales are a very important industry metric. On a related note, did you know that almost all game consoles are actually sold at a loss? The cost of manufacturing, assembling, and distributing the hardware is actually more than what you pay for. Microsoft has recently come out and explicitly said that it costs them up to $200 every time someone purchases a new Xbox. So why do they do that? Well, there are two sides to the answer. On one side, you have the fact that gaming consoles just aren't a viable competitor against PCs. This is also why consoles push for platform-exclusive games. At the end of the day, PCs offer more games, more variety, and more configurability, to the point that even if you want the experience of playing games on your TV sitting on the couch with a controller in your hand, you can just as easily accomplish that with a PC as you can with a console. In some respects, it might even be easier to do that with a PC. But the other side of why consoles are sold at a loss is that the companies know that they can recoup those costs in other ways. First, they can get you with accessories like expensive controllers, but more significantly, they can bleed you and the devs dry all along the way. Developers of Xbox and PlayStation games can expect 30% of their money going to the platform, and while that's also true of Steam, PC games have plenty of other viable platforms like EGS, which prides itself on its 12% split, or like Itch, where devs can decide to contribute as little as 0% of their revenue to the platform. On the consumer side, on top of the bills you're already paying to your ISP, actually connecting your console to the internet requires an additional monthly fee to the console company, and there is just nothing like that for PC. The point being that the practice of selling consoles at a loss should immediately raise a red flag. Why do these companies feel that it's in their interest to practically pay people to buy their consoles? And that's fundamentally what's going on with the Game Pass. There is just no way that it's financially viable on its own. Microsoft is making an investment, much like EA was and EGS is with their free games. What Microsoft's long-term plan is anyone's guess, but they've clearly clinched the market early, and if subscribing for games becomes popular, it'll be good news for them and bad news for everybody else. I mean, as an example, Spotify is a company that makes billions of dollars every year, and even though music is literally the only reason anyone gives a crap about Spotify, they only pay artists a fraction of a penny per stream. And I dread the seemingly inevitable possibility of Game Pass exclusives. Alright, back to Most Wanted. Even though this came out 2 years after Hot Pursuit and was developed by the same studio, I don't think the handling in this game feels as fun, and the crashes are way less mesmerizing. However, in both cases, I think these were intentional decisions, and once again, it's kind of just a matter of taste. The handling still feels really good, it just doesn't provide the same euphoric feeling that drifting does in Hot Pursuit. And it is pretty hilarious how if you land on your wheels after a vicious crash, you can just keep on driving. By far, the biggest nuisance while playing is the speed cameras. The idea is that these are scattered throughout the open world, and you get points for driving super fast past them. The problem is that they make your entire screen flash white twice every time you drive past them, which is super unpleasant, and they even do that during the races. Why? I've actually been editing around it up until now, which is why you might have noticed a few frame skips as I've been driving around. I'll spare you and go back to editing them out again, but just know that I'm suffering through these flashes pretty much constantly. Other than that though, the game is fun. Driving feels really good, and unlike the original Most Wanted, your car can very much affect the others. Ramming and shoving other cars around is a core part of this game, and you even get bonus points for attempting to kill your opponents. Another big departure from the original Most Wanted is the progression, which is very simple in this game. I actually really like it. You unlock cars by simply driving up to them and getting in, which means that in order to get them all, you have to go exploring the open world, which actually gives you something to do. Each car then has its own set of races, eliminating the need to find a faster or better car for a given race. Finishing races in first or second place grants preset rewards for that specific car, making the more challenging races a little more doable, but regardless of your performance, you'll be racking up speed points pretty quickly, and those are the only thing you need to challenge the next person on the most wanted list. When you go to challenge them, first you have to race them while the cops pursue you both, and then you have to ram them to claim their car as your own. This might be literally the best progression I've ever seen for a racing game. I mean, other than no progression at all, but I'd say I like this just as much. It incentivizes exploring the open world, it encourages you to try lots of different cars without having to care about how good each car actually is, and it still allows for tailoring your car to your preference or to the races that you'll be doing. But I think they took the concept a little too far. Like, I wish that I could at least control the color of my car. As it is, the color changes every time you pass through a repair shop, and it's completely random. Also, I'd really like to be able to just change cars on a whim instead of having to fast travel to car-specific places in the world. Speaking of which, switching cars really should not be the only way to fast travel. When you want to do a race, you have to actually drive to its location in the world, and they're not always nearby. Along the way, if the police start chasing you, the amount of time you spend going from race to race may increase significantly. Here you can see me finishing up a long drive to the next race, only to get spotted by the cops right before I arrived. So I figured if I just let them arrest me, they'd spit me out someplace nearby, but nope. I respawned all the way back to where I started, when I entered the car on the other side of the map. Come on. No. Hello, officer. How do you do? Each race has its own introductory cutscene, and these are... well, they're pretty weird. I kinda love all the intros, honestly. I'm dying to know the process behind them, like whose idea was this and who did they have to convince to approve it? Unfortunately, there isn't a story or anything, the cutscenes are just here to perplex us before each race. And last but not least, the music. Once again, it's all licensed music, but it's easily the strongest set of licensed music so far. Okay, the song that plays in the intro makes for kind of a weak first impression. But the songs that play during the first couple actual races make for a good recovery. Overall, I didn't really dislike any of the songs, and they all fit the gameplay great, with some songs that really stand out in a good way. There's also quite a lot of songs, so it's not like you'll be hearing the same ones over and over. I approve. So what to make of Need for Speed Most Wanted? Well, it's definitely one of the better games we've seen here today. It's a really competent racing game. It feels good to drive, and the structure of the game is fantastic. Except it has a few unforced errors, like the lack of fast travel or visual customization, and the constant camera flashing. Ultimately, I didn't actually finish this game either, primarily for two reasons. First, this was the last game I played during this little marathon, and I was definitely feeling some speed fatigue. Second, this game's races are pretty monotonous because they insist on making them take place in a coherent, kind of bland open world. but chances are very high that I'll revisit this game and I'll probably end up playing quite a bit of it. Alright, there we have it. We've seen what both Need for Speed Most Wanteds are offering. Which one's better? Well, this could hardly be easier. It's the newer game. From the graphics to the progression, the original just does not hold up at all if it was ever even good to begin with. The new game handles progression in a way that's a lot more bearable, but its problems are doubly frustrating because it feels like they're really small things. Like, how hard would it be for an option to disable the screen flashing, or to let players start a race from anywhere, or for us to at least control the color of our cars? But it's ultimately the better game in every other respect. One funny thing that came out of EA calling both games Need for Speed Most Wanted is that it's actually tripped up their own information. The release date listed for the newer game on their games platform is actually the release date of the original. Oops. So what should the old game be called? This one's actually super obvious. I don't really remember anybody using the term Most Wanted in the game, but they talk about the Blacklist constantly. This game should have been called Need for Speed Blacklist. Easy peasy. Man, I don't know about you guys, but I found this one kind of exhausting. I have no idea how people could stomach a new Need for Speed game every single year. Particularly because ever since going open world, they don't really offer anything different or novel with each new installment. At least with the older games, you get interesting track layouts and imaginative environments, but those went out the window in favor of placing the races in a coherent open world. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm definitely interested in games that are just as much about driving as they are about racing, but with worlds this small, bland, and empty, I'm not sure any of these open world Need for Speed games really succeeded. By far, the game that most solidly gave me the feeling of going on a journey was the very first one from 1994. Alright, now we're done. Thanks for watching. Tune in next time for the Halloween episode.
Speed, style, build, crew, outlaw. Long ago, the 5 racers lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the outlaw dude showed up. Only the player character, master of all 5 ways to play, could unite them. But when Ventura Bay needed him most, the servers went down.